Well, here's this group called Pink Floyd. We've got, what? Pink what?
The only time I saw Syd Barrett was when he popped into the Abbey Road session when we were doing Atom Heart Mother, and he kind of spun round a couple of times in slow motion and then went out again, and that was about it. That's all I ever saw of him.
He'd gone. He was still looking the same, but he was somewhere else.
We carried on two musical careers at the same time. If we took Interstellar Overdrive outside London, people hated it.
The hand thing, you know, my hands felt like two balloons, that's from being delirious as a child, but this like everything receding. There is no pain, you are receding. It happened to me, and it came back slowly as I sat and played the piano, but I remember thinking, good God, you know, this is a fine line I'm walking here.
We don't need no education.
One bit of riff from another bit of riff. There's hundreds of different ways you can do something. Some have a little bit of magic to them. And the ones that do have that bit of magic to them, it's obvious, to people around. So even just that piece of music has an emotional pull to it. That's what we're struggling to find all the time.
Pink Floyd grew from friendships forged in the 1960s in the university town of Cambridge. Britain was then in the grip of psychedelia and the hippie scene as well. Popular music was undergoing a huge transformation, and the young Syd Barrett was wide open to these influences.
First time I met Syd was at a Saturday morning art class in Cambridge. I was 9 or 10 and he was 8 or 9. We became close, you know, when we were teenagers, talking about smoking dope but not doing it, you know, those days.
I would go along to Syd's after school and he'd be in there painting away. And so then we'd sort of play and chat and do whatever. He was a great rhythm player, terrific sense of time, and, you know, and then he sort of took that and, you know, took it in directions that no one could have imagined, really.
Syd was the charmer when I first met him. He was the charismatic, handsome, jolly, slightly intimidating, the one that everyone focused on.
Most people, including myself, had certain jealousies of what a bright light he appeared to be on the scene. He was physically beautiful, witty, funny. The way he talked, the way he walked, he was much loved by pretty much everyone around him.
I don't actually remember when I met Syd. I don't remember where I met Syd. Just suddenly he was part of my life. The whole Pink Floyd suddenly became part of my life.
The name Pink Floyd first began to appear in January 1965, when the group was then known as the Pink Floyd Blues Band. The band featured a 5-piece lineup formed from a group of friends from Cambridge in England, and originally included Bob Close on guitar and vocals. Bob didn't stick around for too long, and neither did the blues element of the name. By the summer of 1965, the band was slimmed down to a 4-piece, and the name too was reduced to match. For the next couple of years, the band will be known as the Pink Floyd.
Well, you heard the early things, you kind of thought, well, maybe it's the Stones, and you recognise Syd's voice, Roger's voice, but it's not a Pink Floyd sound yet. It needed me to leave to do that. You know, that was quite an important step.
I was involved with this organisation called the London Free School, and I was also at the time working as the head of the London office of Elektra Records. And the guy who was the leader of the London Free School, or there was no official leader, but the real figurehead, the real sort of centre of energy was John Hopkins, known as Hoppy.
It was a sort of melting pot of local people, some of whom were black activists and some of whom were white activists. There was a lot of interest in housing, and a smattering of professional people with different skills. And among the people who set up the London Free School were Andrew King and Peter Jenner, who later on turned out to be the first managers of the Pink Floyd.
They said that there was this group that they knew, and they'd like me to hear a demo tape and maybe take it to Elektra. And I was amazed. I thought they were great. So I very excitedly took this tape to the head of Elektra, who listened and said, nah. And from that point, I made a deal with the Jenner and King that I would try and find them a record deal. During the autumn of '66, I continued to see the Floyd on a regular basis. They became the regular group playing these benefit concerts that they put on in our efforts to raise money for the London Free School at the Church Hall in Palace Square. We felt if we could bottle that and put it on a weekly basis, that people would come.
The UFO Club was born, and although it had a fairly short life, it made a certain dent on the culture.
By 1967, after the obligatory personnel shuffles, Syd Barrett fronted a band which moved to London and now comprised himself on lead vocal and guitar, Roger Waters on bass, Rick Wright on the keyboards, and Nick Mason on the drums.
We always had this notion that when we hit London that we would start a band together. And as it happened, by the time he arrived, I was already playing with a few other people, so he kind of joined in. In fact, Nick and Rick were the sort of permanent ones. There were a bunch of other people who were all at the Regent Street Poly.
I would go to rehearsals that were out of the flat and performances, and obviously there was something special happening with them at the same time.
By early 1967, Floyd were huge news on the thriving underground scene. The band now favoured the unstructured improvisations, which were the basis for long, extended freakouts, which were then highly fashionable with the trendy London-based crowd.
They were known as the first psychedelic band on the London scene. There was a real buzz about them, and there was a real feeling that they were pushing back the frontiers of popular music.
By June, the Floyd had found a management company called Black Hill Enterprises to represent them.
On old Lane had a strange hobby.
Arnold Lane, the first Pink Floyd single, provided a surprise chart hit, although in later years the band did admit that there might have been an element of unofficial chart rigging to help the single on its way.
I got them a deal with Polydor, and so they were playing at the UFO Club at the same time that I brought somebody from Polydor down to see them. They loved them. They said, yes, here you go. And I set up my production company for the purpose of recording the Floyd. And the contracts were all drawn up, lawyers were looking at it back and forth, etc., etc. And in the middle of all of this, Jenner and King signed on with a new agent for them, the Brian Morrison Agency. And by this time, we were ready to go in the studio for Polydor. And in fact, that evening that they made the deal with these agents, we were rehearsing in a small demo studio at Polydor's office. And Jenner rang me up and said, look, the agents would like to come down and meet the group and just hear what you're up to, you know. And they came down, and immediately I felt threatened, and I knew that nothing good was going to come out of this as far as I was concerned. The next day I got a call from Jenner to say that they'd been very impressed with Arnold Lane. We played the song for them. They thought it was great, and they could get us a much better deal with EMI than the deal we had with Polydor. And I was crushed, of course, because the Polydor was my deal. It was going through my production company. And but they wanted me to produce the single. And I said, well, I'll do that, but I want to be assured that I'll be the producer of the album that follows the single. And Brian Morrison said, well, EMI doesn't like to be tied down like that.
He came to me and he said, well, there's this group called Pink Floyd. And I thought, what? Pink what? So he said, Pink Floyd. I said, what are they? He said, well, they're appearing at UFO. I said, UFO? What's UFO? So then he told me this underground freak-out thing in Tottenham Court Road, you know. So he said, would you like to go and see them? So I thought, well, you know, if he thinks they've got something, you know, for recording, then it's worth me going along, which I did. Brian and I came away, we went and had a drink, and he said, well, what do you think? So I said, well, it's not so much the group, very impressive, their show, it's the number of people that were there, fans of theirs. So I said to Brian, yeah, well, I am interested.
Somewhat reluctantly, but I felt, well, if I do a good job on the single, you know, they'll want to keep the team together. And so we went in the studio. We made Arnold Lane and the B-side, Canty and the Currant Bun.
Arnold Lane is a very unusual pop record, sort of full stop, because when you look at when it was written, I mean, you had sort of Ray Davies doing his sort of English vignettes. You had Bowie, who was sort of trying to do a sort of Anthony Newley thing after being a mod. And then you had Syd Barrett come in writing about a knicker snatcher.
Subsequently, EMI loved the record, signed them, gave them a big contract, and said, we're going to use our in-house producers, so thanks very much. And that was the end of my professional relationship with Floyd.
The follow-up single, See Emily Play, also a hit, gave EMI Records the confidence to put Pink Floyd in the studio to record a full album. This was to be called Piper at the Gates of Dawn.
It turned out, yes, they were keen to join EMI. It would be my first major signing, so therefore we'll go ahead with it.
Norman Smith had been an engineer with the Beatles from the point where they'd come to EMI to make demos. This was his first record as full-on producer.
They had to play me songs that they had in mind, and they would obviously play it through the way they knew it, and then I would simply analyse what I thought I could improve to broaden the audience, try to make them more melodic, and to get away from all this psychedelic business, you know. When they played me See Emily Play, I thought, it struck a note, you know. I thought, I think I can make a single out of this, which I did. And what I did, and it was one that I was really able to dress up in my own way as well, also, you know. And I think Syd hated it, to be honest with you. In fact, I'm sure he did. But I thought, please God, this is going to happen.
I think See Emily Play is a fantastic psychedelic single. And to be honest, it was still quite early in what is seen as sort of British psychedelia. I mean, then you had everyone going on top of the pops wearing their hastily bought cravats and doing their versions of it. But at that point, I mean, you'd had Strawberry Fields Forever, White Shade of Pale was around, but See Emily Play just comes from another place altogether.
It's a great subject. It has a lovely production sound. It has not too many gimmicks at the time. We don't have huge amounts of, for example, phasing in those records, or things that make them sound dated. It sounds very much of its time and very much for any time.
At about the time See Emily Play was riding high in the charts, Syd's behaviour deteriorated markedly.
As it started to climb up the charts, I thought the next thing that's going to happen is Top of the Pops. Before they went on, they actually went into makeup. I was waiting for them in their dressing room. As soon as they walked in, I saw Syd, and he looked wonderful. So straight away, I made the mistake of saying, "Syd, you look absolutely wonderful." And he went, "Oh," and he walked over to the mirror, saw himself, ugh, and he immediately scruffed up all his hair, got tissues and started wiping off the makeup, etc. And I thought, what am I going to do with this guy, you know? Anyway, he went on like that, and stood there with his guitar just dangling, didn't even try to play it, head sort of bowed, complete and utter, nothing. And of course, I mean, I was furious. And that was the first signs for me, mentally something was missing, something was going.
We did the Pat Boone show, and Pat Boone came on and, you know, said hello. And what Syd would do is, through every run-through or rehearsal, we were miming to see Emily play or something, I think, like that. And through the run-throughs, he'd be miming away. And then they'd go, OK, we'll take it, because we were taping it. And then when they went, action, he'd stand there like that. Cut. OK, we're doing it now, guys. Ready? And Syd would go, yeah. And he'd do it, and he'd do it again and again, until finally we had to say, listen, he's a bit weird, you know, I'll mime it.
From a very early age, he didn't believe in rules, and I imagine he was subjected to quite a few rules in that studio. I mean, Norman Smith was one of the old school, and I imagine getting to record at a certain time and getting to sing a song in a certain way, all this must have been very difficult for someone like Syd, who was very much a creature of the times, a product of his era, who didn't like being told what to do. Each time Norman left the studio, he said it was with a splitting headache, and he said dealing with Syd Barrett was like dealing with a child. He'd just look at you blankly some of the time, and one minute he'd be up, the next he'd be down. Norman Smith did not enjoy the experience of working with Syd Barrett.
It was pretty damn difficult with Syd Barrett.
It was Piper that put the band on the map. Its endearing brand of psychedelic whimsy was perfect for the mood of the day. Barrett clearly had his finger on the pulse of the national mood. However, the first glimpse of a full album's worth of Pink Floyd was something of a musical enigma. The album was so steeped in psychedelia, it could only have been made in 1967. Alongside Barrett's whimsical mannered compositions such as The Gnome and Bike, we find full-blown space rock epics like Interstellar Overdrive and Astronomy Domini. The overall effect is one of almost palpable confusion, as two completely different and totally irreconcilable musical personalities battle it out for supremacy. Not surprisingly, the results are somewhat confusing in musical terms.
When the debut album came out in 1967, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, it was generally enthusiastically received, with one notable exception: the clientele of the UFO Club in Tottenham Court Road, which became to Pink Floyd what the Cavern had been to the Beatles, were generally rather sniffy towards this album. And there was a widespread opinion that The Piper at the Gates of Dawn had quite significantly failed to capture the band's live sound.
I think Piper at the Gates of Dawn is a great album.
Piper at the Gates of Dawn is the best Floyd album for me. I absolutely love it. It's the sound of a band going to places where no one had ever been before. Totally innovative, totally experimental.
You take some of the songs off the first album. You know, Bike. I've got a bike, you can ride it if you like. It's got a basket, a bell that rings and things to make it look good. I'd give it to you if I could, but I borrowed it. There's something about the way the lyric attaches to the meter in a very satisfying way, but then it gets, but I borrowed it, kind of kicks it off into, there's something very English about that, about the completeness of that, and yet the fact that it's so unpredictable. I think it was the unpredictability of it combined with its simplicity that made it so special.
Piper at the Gates of Dawn, I think, sits as a unique artefact separate from the rest of Pink Floyd. It was a different band.
People actively hate Pink Floyd for what they became, but embrace that, you know, the Syd era Pink Floyd, and it's almost like a badge, you know. I absolutely hate Pink Floyd, but the first album.
By the time the band came to make its second album, Syd was no longer functioning as either performer or writer.
I think Syd's illness, it probably, you know, we can say that marijuana to a certain extent and acid to a large extent can do nothing but exacerbate that collection of symptoms that we put together and loosely describe as schizophrenia, you know. And so there is no doubt but that those things are very bad for schizophrenics. They worsen the condition and so on and so forth. And there is no doubt that Syd was schizophrenic and that he was taking those drugs at the same time.
We had a sort of style almost of, if there was a problem, ignore it. And it finally sort of came to the point where we ignored it by not picking Syd up one day, just going off with the other four of us.
Syd was the creative force behind the original recording lineup of Pink Floyd. Not only was he the lead vocalist and the guitarist, he was also the writer of all the fledgling group's material. Now, without Syd to call upon, Pink Floyd needed both a guitarist and a writer. Finding the guitarist was relatively easy. David Gilmour, friend of Syd's from Cambridge, had been drafted in as the fifth member to provide on-stage cover for the increasingly unstable frontman. When Syd drifted out of the picture, Gilmour was already in place. Filling the gap left by Barrett, the writer, proved to be somewhat bigger of a challenge. Overnight, the hit singles suddenly dried up.
Losing the flow of songs was disastrous for us at that point, because he was doing most of the writing. So he said, why doesn't he just write songs and come and record and we'll go and do gigs? But there's no way we can do that anymore.
They rang up and actually made me a specific offer, which obviously was the start of a very difficult and strange time, with both Syd and I turning up together to rehearsals and going out and doing shows with 5 of us, where I would be learning and playing Syd's parts and singing Syd's songs, while Syd would be sort of standing there and sometimes singing a little bit and sometimes playing a little bit, and very odd.
Shall I roar with laughter, or shall I try and kill him? I don't, certainly as far as I'm concerned, I don't remember being overcome with compassion. Having said that, as I say, I think there were a number of people who did try and do their best for him, and there were attempts to get him to therapy and so on.
We never actually managed to get him through the front door. We, got him to the door a couple of times, but never got him through the door.
I think someone said that they described all of Syd's symptoms to him, and he did say something like, well, are you sure this is Syd's problem? Which maybe was a good thing to say.
One night, soon after Barrett was ousted from the band, when he came into the UFO club and he stood right in front of Gilmour on stage. Gilmour recounted later that Syd's head was about at his foot height, and he just stood there throughout the Floyd set, glaring upwards straight into Gilmour's eyes for about 35 minutes. And bear in mind, Gilmour and Barrett had been friends since childhood, and really remained friends for years and years afterwards. But that incident had a very profound effect on Gilmour, who confided to his flatmates afterwards that he didn't think he could carry on anymore. He was that disturbed by that particular evening.
The group as a whole was greater than the sum of the parts, and that's why Floyd managed to survive after Syd left, because that essence of what they were doing together survived.
Syd was a great performer, and a great, you never knew what was going to come from Syd's guitar. Now, I saw a lot of great performers around that period, and Syd was definitely a great performer, no getting away from it, very challenging.
The definition of the word genius extends to someone who makes a profound effect on the lives of others. And if you take that, then I think you can apply it to Syd Barrett quite well.
I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that English pop never really recovered from the loss of Syd Barrett as a writer and indeed as a guitarist. He was never adequately replaced.
Syd Barrett made only a marginal contribution to A Saucerful of Secrets, the second Pink Floyd album. The pop sensibilities of Piper are increasingly buried under layers of avant-garde experimentation as Floyd begin to grasp their way towards the sound which made them a worldwide success. Highlights include Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun and the Heavenly Voices section of the title track. Simple, straight numbers such as Jug Band Blues and Corporal Clegg now seem slightly out of place, as the main emphasis is clearly on the instrumental heavyweights.
Jug Band Blues is one of the saddest things you can hear, it really is. There's a version of it which was recorded for John Peel's show just before Christmas 1967, so really on the cusp of Syd's last days as a member of the Pink Floyd. And I've known people who were reduced to tears over that thing.
Yes, I defy anyone to listen to Jug Band Blues almost 40 years after it was written, and defy them not to be terribly moved by the lyrics in that particular song.
It's the one flash of Syd that you get on Saucerful of Secrets, and it's like he's addressing the fact that he's not quite with it anymore mentally.
I believe Jug Band Blues is the ultimate self-diagnosis of schizophrenia. The line that goes, "It's awfully considerate of you to think of me here, and I'm most obliged to you for making it clear that I'm not here." It's clearly been written by someone who's aware of what is happening to him. And not only that, but there's even glimpses of Syd's dark sense of humour in there, because there's another line that actually speculates on what would become of the Floyd without him.
For this album, Norman Smith was moved upstairs to become executive producer, as the band increasingly sought to control their own destiny in the studio. The results are definitely patchy, but there are enough pointers as to where Floyd were going.
People thought, which way are Pink Floyd going to go? And the answer was that they could just go on forever, and they could extend the arrangements that they'd already started experimenting with to reach the point where literally they were painting sort of kind of broad landscapes of sound, and that was the thing that they developed on their later albums and made them so successful throughout the world.
The title track, Saucerful of Secrets, and Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun definitely hint at what was to come. Their continued exploration with sound effects, which were a great thing, and the extended themes were absolutely brilliant.
They are the first band to totally explore stereo, the spectrum of stereo. They use it like no one else has used it. The only other band to use sound effects are actually the Beatles. Everyone else would talk about it, but they actually used it, and Floyd were the next band on to really use it.
Because of the experimentation I'd been doing with sounds, each song that came up that I listened to, I would be going through my head, I reckon perhaps some of those sounds could work here. So it was to be built as one went along for each song. Sometimes, of course, some songs didn't need those sort of gimmicks at all, but like feedback or tape loops played backwards and an echo added to it and all stuff like that.
Set the Controls is one of my favourite tracks from that era, because it's really quite strange and it has a particular mood, and that's one of the things they were always very good at getting, or still are, you know, is creating a mood.
The taboo against songs longer than 3 minutes had been lifted in a way. There have been, you know, different groups doing longer, sort of extended instrumentals and things like that. And so they were able to put on record the way that they sounded in person much more. If you'd had a record full of stuff like Interstellar Overdrive as the second record, with Syd still in full control of his faculties, he might have written some very clever, wonderful songs, maybe better songs than appeared on subsequent Floyd records. But his way to fill a 10-minute stretch of instrumental was a lot more grating and hard for people to deal with, I think, mass market to deal with, than the sort of spacey blues guitar playing of Dave Gilmour, which is much more accessible.
I think it's interesting because on Saucerful you have to sort of struggle to hear him, and I think his first period in Floyd was characterised by this sort of strange mixture of trying to be Syd, maybe trying to be Hendrix, and also trying to be himself. I think where you do hear it, and it's great, and it's quite almost lost in Let There Be More Light, there's this solo at the end, which is this mixture of what becomes a David Gilmour guitar solo with him doing a Syd Barrett guitar solo. So I think that's the first time you really notice him as a guitarist.
I think Saucerful of Secrets is a much easier album to listen to. But then, of course, being someone who likes Pink Floyd, and again, Pink Floyd's influenced me a lot in the studio, it's an album where you can actually go back and get quite a few good ideas from, whereas with the Piper at the Gates of Dawn, not so much.
Well, it was more experimentation, in more of a psychedelic way, wasn't it? They were kind of jamming around the riffs, I think. You know, that a little bit darker in a way. You know, it was very experimental, very kind of cosmic sound to it, I think. Whereas before it was more whimsical.
And it seemed very much that it was, okay, that's the end of that particular era of Floyd. And interestingly, now we move into the future where things got far more entangled.
In addition to studio recordings at this time, Floyd were also producing soundtrack music for films. The original soundtrack for the film More was the first of two soundtracks made for the French director Babette Schroeder.
More is about people going off to seek a hedonistic lifestyle in Ibiza and spiralling downwards into heroin addiction, and it's not a pleasant watch. It's not a film that has a happy ending, and it's not something that really celebrates the hippie dream.
You've got to look at the Floyd in their kind of original context, which is they were part of this new underground culture that was coming out, and it spread far beyond just music and fashion. It was informing all different walks of life, writing, painting, and 60s filmmaking was very radical. And I think directors started to see the potential of using Pink Floyd's music and sound to inform and make their film work better. And they had all the connections.
When Floyd make soundtrack albums, they sound really like soundtrack albums. They are probably one of the few bands that do very well at that area. They're really good. And their music does lend itself fantastically to those sort of fantastic films. So, and they probably found it really they're very, they're very artistic people and very articulate people. They probably found it quite, exhilarating is the word I was looking for, to do something like that. So they probably got a lot out of it.
Pink Floyd became a very different band from 68, 69 onwards. But around the time this film's made, they've got into this groove that they had at that time, and there's a level of criticism can be made of this that says that a lot of it sounds the same and a lot of it's quite mid-tempo. And I think when you listen to what they're doing at that stage, that's true.
It's unfair to judge the soundtrack albums by the same standards as the studio albums. It was never intended for albums like More to be representative of the band's regular output.
With the band still working to find a solid direction in writing terms, the next album was to be a curious hybrid.
I tried to encourage them in their own sort of producing at home. They all had little studio things that they could do, record on, and just simply bring them into the studio with me and I'll go through them, etc. So I encouraged them to more and more produce themselves, and particularly Ummagumma, where they each had a section of that album to themselves. They could do exactly whatever they wanted.
I have a memory of working as an assistant, a tape op on some of the Piper at the Gates of Dawn sessions, and I was extremely impressed because that was wonderful. So you had this expectation that this was going to be great. You were going to come in and you were going to do all these wonderful songs, and it didn't turn out quite like that. They all came in and we all sat there, and Norman said to him, "Well, have you got some songs?" And they said no, and had to decide what they were going to do in terms of what they were going to do for this record. They had to make a record, they got sessions, but what were they going to do? And after much discussion, it was decided that they would have a quarter of the record each to do whatever they wanted, and that the others would, the other three would assist the one whose quarter it was to do. Now, I mean, at that stage, probably there would have been other producers who would have said, "No, sorry, we'll cancel the sessions, go away, write some songs, come back and we'll do them." Whereas Norman went with it, and we ended up with what we ended up with.
And I wouldn't interfere. They could do, unless I could help them.
It's an integration between the music and the effects. You can't really separate the two out. I mean, you can listen to any of the four parts, and they all have the integration of effects and music or sounds or experimentation or whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of double speed and half speed stuff going on in there, backward stuff going on in there. Be interesting to pull it apart and actually see what it was at the time, you know, what they're saying.
Ummagumma marks the end of the pastoral era of Pink Floyd, which flowered briefly with tracks like The Scarecrow and ends with the gentle, wistful melodies of Grantchester Meadows. Although the song marks the end of an era in one sense, the prominent use of sound effects looks forward to the future of Pink Floyd. The track itself is gentle and pleasant, but it lacks a standout melody or the innovative flourish which would mark out the later Floyd from the rest of the world.
Grantchester Meadows might actually be an underrated minor classic, because Grantchester Meadows is one of the first places where we hear Waters' voice with the preoccupations that would take him right through the rest of his career with the band and with the solo stuff. And the preoccupations are with the war, with dysfunctional relationships, especially in families. And in the case of Grantchester Meadows, you've got this kind of elegiac looking back to something you've lost. You've got the passing in the sunshine of a bygone afternoon, bringing sounds of yesterday into this city room. And a lot of the time, it's the same thing that infuses his feelings of loss for Syd. Shine on you crazy diamond, and searches for shelter from pigs on the wing. And I think Grantchester Meadows is the first flowering of that. I think it's also important for the way that Roger Waters sings. On the live performance we have Roger and David singing together, and that was a new dimension, because on Ummagumma it's part of the album which featured each of the Pink Floyd doing solo things. So it's entirely Roger's idea, and he certainly did like tape manipulations and sound effects, and we have that in abundance in the live performance and on the LP. But the way that Roger's voice has developed there is moving away from, I think, being purely a pop singer and trying to do a sort of psychedelic club shout, and that might well make it a pointer to what was to come later.
And I've always said that Roger Waters was a grandmaster at timing. He was not a great bass player, didn't need to be. His art is in timing. It's the when to do something, now or not.
Overall, the experiment strays too far towards free-form instrumental exploration, without enough of the melodic counterpoint which was to make the next album so successful. Waters himself later described the album as a disaster. Although Ummagumma had proved an inconsistent experience, the band continued to work hard, and the constant touring saw them improve very much in the live arena. Life on tour and playing together almost every night was sharpening up the group's collective skills as a writing unit as well. The results of this process would be seen in the next album, Atom Heart Mother, released in October 1970. This album was to be the first real breakthrough for Pink Floyd. The whole first side of the album comprised an avant-garde instrumental piece featuring choir and orchestral elements arranged by Ron Geesin.
What happened in Atom Heart Mother was that because they were kind of exhausted because of commitments and demands by the manager and EMI Records, they needed some other input. So because I was friends with them all, I was asked to be that input, really. They had 5 or 6 little sections that they had recorded at EMI Abbey Road of what I call a backing track, and they had then stuck these together as you do with magnetic tape. So with that they'd come up with a tape which was an accompaniment tape lasting, I can't remember, 23 minutes or something. It might have been 25 and a half or whatever. It was under 30 and over 20. And they gave me that, a rough mix of that tape, and we had some discussions about what might go on it. They said they wanted a big sound, and we had a very short session, and I'm talking like a morning and another bit of an afternoon somewhere, I think, where Rick Wright came round my studio in Ladbroke Grove, London West 10, and we looked at the choir section. So he maybe suggested some notes or a way of going, but there was nothing written down. There was nothing written down for the choir at that time, at that session. And then Dave came round with a sort of an arpeggio, and suggesting that for what was in fact the main theme, the first theme. The rest of it was me. It's a concoction. It's an assembly. The speeds were all wrong. Like when you're moving through a piece, you know when it should speed up, you know when it should slow down. In fact, the reverse happened with some of the sections, because when they stuck the sections together, they didn't actually really work. So my job was to craft something sensible on top of this rather cobbled collage or montage and make it look like it was working. The art bit was getting a couple of melodies that really worked, and I believe that the opening theme melody really works, and the cello melody really works. They're entirely out of my head.
Both of them are quite expansive. They cover quite a wide range. I mean, the horn one starts on the space of about an octave, but then it expands. And then further. So you've covered that whole space, which is quite wide-ranging. If you then look at the cello theme, it starts down at the same place. It's actually slightly wider, but not much. So they both have this sense of expansiveness, of space. They're not claustrophobic.
Atom Heart Mother featured more of the gentler, pastoral Floyd sound, which characterised the albums around about this time. The Roger Waters song If and Gilmore's Fat Old Son proved to be the highlights of the mellow second side of the album.
How on earth does a song like Fat Old Son sit on the same album as Atom Heart Mother?
In some ways it reminds me a bit of a sort of country song, you know. It's sort of weird because on the same album there's this completely and utterly pretty standard song, but I quite like it.
When they play it on stage, it's like a different song. It's got all the dynamics, all the passion, all the greatness of Floyd tracks.
The one thing that the Pink Floyd, to me, have always been able to do is transmit their emotion from the record to the listener. I think that's why they've been so popular. It was a group effort and everybody was, you know, enjoying it, and I think that comes across.
Here's the opening sequence for Atom Heart Mother. Under the horn melody. A 4-chord sequence which just repeats. It doesn't repeat the same every time, but pretty well. What do we get under Fat Old Son? Exactly the same. Metrically, it's exactly the same. You've got this ponderous 4/4. What is different between Fat Old Son and Atom Heart Mother is that you have some lyrics, so it makes it a song. Well, that matters. That takes it out of the realm of Atom Heart Mother greatly. And you have no orchestral instruments. But other than that, they're exactly the same. They come from exactly the same stable and exactly the same way of thinking.
Maybe in a way, the album had to have these more subdued and cooler tracks, otherwise you might have gone mad.
This sleeve is just another major step in Floyd's visual presentation. Always great, always good, always different, always worth looking at, always very inventive and always very thoughtful. I don't think Floyd have ever made a bad cover.
Storm Thorgerson was asked to come up with an original cover. I mean, all his covers are original. But they always say, we want this one more original than the last one. And so he said to somebody, go out and shoot some cows. So someone went out with a camera and shot some cows. I mean, you know, with a camera, not with a... The cow on the cover was another part of the process of random composition that was going on. In other words, take ingredients from here and there and stick them together. The title was got by me saying to Roger, you'll find a title in that newspaper there. And this was in the studio back room at the BBC recording. So Roger picked up the newspaper, and it was one of the popular tabloids, and found a title, Atom Heart Mother, and it was about a woman who'd just given birth and had a pacemaker, one of the first ever pacemakers fitted. That was it. But that was the process, and that was the kind of way that we were going.
They had established themselves originally as 3-minute hit single people in a way, with C. Emily playing Arnold Lane, and although live, of course, they'd always experimented and played longer pieces, but now they could do that on albums too.
With Atom Heart Mother, the band was now firmly into its musical stride, and the signs were auspicious for the next album. When it finally arrived in November 1971, Meddle was to exceed all expectations.
It is the album where they moved from post-Barrett experimentalists trying to find their identity. It's where they began to find their identity and hit on the motifs that they would then turn into the tremendous and transcendent Dark Side of the Moon.
With this album, Pink Floyd demonstrated that the group had learned how to take their original sound effects, which the band had made their own, and weave them together with the music to create a seamless blend, which was to become synonymous with Pink Floyd. The results are best seen still in Echoes.
It's got all of the great Floyd qualities coming together, possibly for the very first time. The drama, the dynamics, really individual, distinctive lead guitar playing, gorgeous melodies, harmony singing. That's Rick Wright and Dave Gilmour singing together.
Very close harmonies always between Rick Wright and Dave Gilmour. They're always kind of, there's certainly nothing sweet and birdsy and poppy going on in there, you know.
Echoes was the centrepiece of Meddle, was the centrepiece of their live show at that time, and was a melding together of many episodes, and was something that they could replicate live very, very well.
Echoes is absolutely a landmark in Pink Floyd's career. It's the one which probably meant that they didn't just wind up roundabout now being just another psychedelic band who couldn't get a break. It's when they learnt how to come up with an extended, expanded piece of music to make it accessible to the casual listener.
Echoes also formed the foundations of the superb film Pink Floyd at Pompeii, directed by French director Adrien Marben. Pink Floyd had always been greatly appreciated in Europe, and the Pompeii film is the result of a European co-production. It is still rightly regarded by many as the best evocation of the Floyd in the live environment. On the whole, the album is still a rather patchy offering, in which the weaker moments outnumber the strong.
It's what Meddle represented rather than its content. You know, after all this sort of messing about with film soundtracks, live albums, you know, projects like Atom Heart Mother, I think that it was probably the first true post-Syd Pink Floyd album.
The real Pink Floyd masterpiece was just around the corner. In March 1973, Pink Floyd released the album which would take them into the musical stratosphere, Dark Side of the Moon.
With Dark Side of the Moon, everything came together beautifully. The songs were fascinating, state-of-the-art technology interested people, the album cover was intriguing. Everything about it hit at the right time.
In my opinion, Dark Side was the most accessible Floyd album to date. I mean, it was the most rounded. And in a sense, it was the sort of underground rock's Sgt. Pepper, if you like.
Dark Side of the Moon started off with as a mishmash, as the band sitting down once they'd finished touring in America in early 1971 and thinking, we've got to do a new album, what have we got? And they had some ideas, bits and bobs. Dave Gilmour always says, nothing gels, and so one day Roger Waters walked in and said, I've got this idea, let's do this as a concept album.
With a great gig in the sky, Rick Wright's piano playing for me is absolutely fantastic. And he's coming from a kind of a jazz angle.
Even just that piece of music has an emotional pull to it. That's what we're struggling to find all the time.
I went up to Abbey Road. I had no idea what it was. Nobody told me. I didn't know whether I was going to walk into the studio. There was going to be a choir, 2 other girls, 3 other girls. No idea. So I walked into the control room and the band were there, and they proceeded to explain to me that they were doing this album. It was nearly finished, and the concept of the album, birth and death and everything else in between, and they played me the backing track, and I said, well, what do you want? And basically they had no idea. So I thought, oh, fine, lovely. And when I look back, I was fairly new to this sort of world, you know, and probably quite naive. But anyway, I listened to the track a couple of times, and I personally had no idea what to do or what they wanted. So I said, I think the best thing for me is to go into the studio, put the cans on, and have a little go and see what happens. So I started off by going, oh, baby, baby, yeah, yeah, baby, baby, which is what one tended to do for sort of scat sort of singing. And they said, oh, no, 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 we don't want any words. Well, that really stumped me. So David Gilmour came. I have to say that he was really the one that directed me. There wasn't a word from anybody else, as far as I can remember. And so David said, would you like me to write out the chord sequence? And I said, no, 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 no. And it sort of happened when I thought, well, I really don't know what they want. I don't know, but okay, best feet forward, you know. And I thought, well, and I've said this many times, but it's absolutely true, that I thought, I have to pretend to be an instrument. And that gave me an avenue to explore. And so I started doing something. He said, we like that. So I said to Alan, okay, put the red light on, record this, because usually the first take is the best. And I started singing and did it. I went into the control room and they played it, and not a lot was said. And I said, oh, well, thank you very much, goodbye, and left. And I was convinced it would never see the light of day because they hadn't commented, they hadn't made any, do you know what I mean? They hadn't said great, awful, nothing. Great Gig is slightly different from the rest of the album. And I think it is because there's an outside influence, which is somebody else came in, happened to be me, it could have been, I don't know, could have been Vicky Brown, I don't know, or a saxophone player, but with the voice, you get a whole different input, some different mindset. And I think that's perhaps why it stands out, because it is not the 4 people in the band that have totally done it. There's an outside influence.
The use of Claire Torrey on that album is something that I think every female vocalist, whoever you are, has got to listen to and aspire to, you know. One day I will crack that whole piece and I'll just be the happiest person alive.
It's a taxing piece to sing from beginning to end. And in fact, I believe that when Floyd or Roger have, they don't always do Great Gig in the Sky, but if they have, the three backing vocalists do a third each, which makes it less exhausting.
This, the ultimate Floyd album, captured just the right blend of lyricism, inspired instrumental passages, sound effects and genuine musical innovation. Just how to follow up a massive success without disappointing the public is always regarded as one of the most difficult tasks in music. The response from Pink Floyd to the worldwide acclaim for Dark Side of the Moon was to deliver Wish You Were Here, released in September 1975. A classic recording which in many respects outshone its illustrious predecessor.
When I think about it, I can still see his eyes. It was everything else that was different.
7 years of no contact, and then to walk in while we're actually doing that particular track.
Didn't recognise him at all.
He'd shaven all his hair off. He was about probably 17, 18 stone.
I had no idea who he was for a long time, and neither did anybody else, I didn't think, for a while.
Coincidence, karma, fate, who knows, but it was very, very, very powerful.
Shine On You Crazy Diamond is a masterpiece, it's a masterwork. It is in a way a representation of their entire career up to that point in one track.
Shine on, you crazy diamond.
I sort of knew that really we were over as far as the Band of Brothers notion of a pop group was concerned. We just weren't anymore, and we were never going to be that again. And so I was mourning that loss as well as the loss of Syd as a friend and as a colleague.
I don't know where it came from. As I say, I might have been just playing an A minor chord. Boring old. And just moved my fingers to the wrong position. It could just be an accident, but it did seem to sort of have a sort of haunting, calling sound to it.
Shine On You Crazy Diamond, with its majestic introduction, is arguably the finest recording in the entire Pink Floyd canon. Once again, there are no fillers or throwaway numbers on this flawless album. Every track pulls its weight.
I think it's our best album. I love it lyrically, but I also love it just musically. And I love the flow of it, and I just think, I will listen to that album for pleasure. There's not many of the Floyd albums I can.
I feel that the Wish You Were Here album doesn't have a set theme or a set tone. Every song seems to be slightly different, from Shine On You Crazy Diamond to the barbs of Have a Cigar to the almost distressed insouciance of Welcome to the Machine, almost the acceptance of, well, what are we going to do? To Wish You Were Here, which seems to be a longing for something that's already gone.
It has an emotional depth, and it's sort of fairly universal, I think. And I suppose you could say that we haven't done quite as many concerts as people like the Stones have or someone. So my performances of Wish You Were Here still number in sort of 300 or 400, I suppose, instead of the thousands that some people might do. But it still resonates. It still has its meaning. It means that to me every time I sing it. That in the control room of number 3 studio at Abbey Road, and It's just something I'd been strumming at home. And Roger immediately said, "What's that? What's that?" And we had to sort of immediately get on with that and work it up and write the rest of the music and stuff.
I don't think Wish You Were Here as a song represents what the album was about so much as an element of what the album was about. And the album went in different directions, and a lot of the album is couched in Syd Barrett terms, not in the way the music was presented, but in the way that they were trying to bring this ghost from the past into the modern environment, to still make him part of what they were doing, because he was very much still a crucial element in the Pink Floyd story.
Sadly, this was to be the last album produced as a real cohesive joint effort by the entire band. Animals, released in January 1977, was the first of 3 Floyd albums which were masterminded by Roger Waters. Fortunately, the album also coincided with Waters reaching his very best form as a writer. The choice of subject matter on Animals is typically bleak and joyless, but instrumentally, the band continued to shine as brightly as ever.
Rick Wright plays very much a backseat role in this album. He plays a lot of pads, simple backing. But the lovely Rhodes piano intro to Sheep is one of the last times we'd hear him in full flow for quite some time. Absolutely excellent. There were no really strong melodies like Us and Them or Money or anything like that. But just it showed the depth that Roger Waters would go into to explore lyrical themes. Very clever lyrics, a great piece of composition by Roger Waters, and by now he was putting his indelible stamp as the leader of the direction of Pink Floyd.
It was the start of a kind of a dispute between Roger Waters and Rick Wright, their keyboard player, and Dave Gilmour, their lead guitar player, which was sort of I think it was quite an angst-ridden atmosphere while they were actually making that album.
They were looking for a guitar player. Their manager got my name. I think I was recommended as being an ordinary guy, you know, could play a bit. And so he called me up and said the boys are finishing their album. Do you want to come to the studio and meet them? That was the Animals album, that was 76. And so I went along and they said, well, yeah, you know, can you play a bit of bass? I said, yeah. And can you, do you want to do the gig? Yeah. And I said to David Gilmour, yeah, I'd love to do it, but you know, maybe we should have a little jam so you can see how I play and make sure. And he said, you wouldn't be here if you couldn't play, would you? And I said, well, no, not really. And he said, well, that's all right then. The first tour I did was the Animals album tour, and that was much more free. You know, especially towards the end of the set, there was a lot more freedom to do bits and pieces and stretch out a bit.
Animals will forever be associated with images of flying pigs. As with Atom Heart Mother and Dark Side of the Moon, Hypnosis had infused an ordinary, everyday image with such potency that the band did not even have to put its name on the cover. In many respects, the Animals album cover and the promotional activity surrounding it marks the finest hour for the Hypnosis-Floyd partnership. Animals is remembered as a triumph for Hypnosis, who took an unpromising image and transformed it into something iconic.
They did use Battersea Power Station, and I doubt they ever believed how iconic that would become, because it did become so synonymous with Pink Floyd. You know, even in the tours they did in For Momentary Lapse of Reason, you know, they had the pig flying across the Wembley Stadium and anywhere else they played. So, yeah, it's a classic cover, a classic rock cover.
The cover of Animals, of course, is an icon of rock music. To take something as everyday and simple as a disused power station and turn it into something so powerful suggests that it's not just the music at which genius is at work. I think Hypnosis display an element of genius and how well they were able to create that cover and to make it something that's recognised worldwide.
With Animals, it created the basis for a very successful, huge American tour, and of course it was famous for the cover, if as much as the music in a way, because they had the famous flying pig of a Battersea Power Station, and somehow or other it managed to escape, and the pig flew off over London. It was last seen flying over London Airport at 5,000 feet.
Often overlooked in favour of what went before and after, Animals represented another milestone in the run of amazing Floyd albums.
Animals, very successful musically. I see a little bit more of tugging and pulling. You can hear a little bit of that as well.
I think that some of the lyrics in Animals were particularly daring. You know, there was some real attacks going on. It was always brave. Whatever the Floyd did was always just, we're going to do this. You know, whether it was against the record company, whether it was against the government, whether it was against the time, the fashion, they just did it. And I think that's really one of the things that made them so successful.
The live shows were becoming increasingly elaborate. This trend would culminate in the spectacle of The Wall. Released in November 1979, The Wall was produced by Bob Ezrin. Ezrin hugely deserved his producer's credit, but as the chief architect of the album, the majority of plaudits were rightfully channeled towards Roger Waters, who fully deserved the praise for his part in creating what is still a milestone in rock music.
Well, The Wall has been called one of the most successful and most imaginative rock albums of the whole rock era, you know, the 60s, 70s and 80s, because it did combine not just a concept in terms of music and songs and lyrics, but also a visual concept as well. It lends itself to a much bigger, more experimental project. So The Wall kind of grew and grew, really, became a big monster out of control.
It was a very big undertaking, and it was very, very well done. It was done to a very high standard, elegant, powerfully affecting, but hugely negative in its content. I mean, that has to be said, that, you know, if you look at the lyrics, if you read the subtext of what's going on, you just go out and slash your wrists.
I mean, Syd appears in The Wall a lot, you know, which is where, you know, in the movie where the cigarette burns down between the fingers. Well, I went into the room and saw that. My friendship with him and his illness combined, provide an enormous opportunity for grief. It's sad. It's very sad. I'm still very sad about it.
With The Wall, he was expressing all the bricks in the wall were all the things in his life that had upset him or made him the way he was.
That was the thing that they played on. I think this was largely from Roger's sense of alienation. He was an uneasy pop star, I think it was fair to say, and he had sort of doubts about his role in some ways, you know, none at all in others.
A very important part of this song is that the melody that Roger Waters sings, the bass player, is doubled by a guitar part. So he sings, and the guitar plays that part as well. Then on top of that is this very cleverly, very simple but cleverly constructed Dave Gilmour guitar part. So that's the D minor chord, that's the first chord. Then he moves to G major, but he's moving into what's called the first position, and he plays this phrase. And he goes back to the D minor. Then he plays quite a famous little phrase that goes, so that's a whole verse and a chorus of the song. It's not a particularly long song, although they do several versions of it during the album, The Wall. It's really a blues song by its structure.
There was that underlying disco-fied beat almost, which did enable it to cross over somewhat strangely. I don't really know if it's that detectable or discernible, but you know, it's an unusual musical path for the Floyd to take. And obviously then you had the very memorable playground chant, "We don't need no education," which you know, I think it struck a chord with a load of disaffected teenagers who genuinely thought they didn't.
It gave a voice to the downtrodden masses. I think that was the idea. And the idea of actually speaking up about perhaps injustice in schools and that sort of thing, that's what it was all about, really. That was new, nobody had done that before.
Rising tensions between Roger Waters and Rick Wright led to the keyboard player being sacked.
None of them had made any money from The Wall. The Wall had been such an expensive production. The only person, ironically, who made any money was Rick Wright, the original keyboards player, who had been involved in the production of The Wall, or wanted to be involved in the production of The Wall, but allegedly was not very active in that role. And Roger Waters had demanded that he be fired from the group. Then they realised that they haven't got anyone to play keyboards on the stage, so they get him back in on a wage. So in fact, he is actually the only member of Pink Floyd to make any money out of The Wall.
The live shows which promoted the album were an unforgettable experience. Ambitious in their scope and their staging, Waters' themes of alienation and separation took physical form with the creation of a real wall.
I remember going to see the show at the Earl's Court in London and watching the slow process of building the brick wall which goes on throughout the entire show, gradually laying this line of bricks, and you think, what are they doing? How's it all going to resolve? And of course gradually the band disappear behind the huge barrier, and in the final moments the whole lot is destroyed and smashed to pieces. When Roger realises that maybe it's not a good idea, psychologically speaking, to have a mental barrier inside your head.
When I think back, I think, wow, that was quite a big show. And it's very impressive that Roger could actually put that sort of thing together technically to make it work, building the wall and knocking it down.
Written into the structure of the show was the nature of what they termed the surrogate band. So for instance, the show opens with a thing that is largely instrumental. It's certainly a big, bombastic instrumental opening. Then the light goes down. At the end of the song, the bands freeze the image. A Lancaster bomber or something flies over the head of the crowd. The lights come up on a stage that's higher than the stage that they've just seen Pink Floyd play the opening number. And there on the higher stage is Pink Floyd playing the second number. So it's like, hang on. You know, that was Pink Floyd down there. And that was the illusion that they constantly played on. And they used what they termed the surrogate band, which was myself, Andy Bown, Willie Wilson and Pete Wood, as the surrogates. And we were given latex masks and made to look exactly like Pink Floyd.
Gerald Scarfe, as I understand it, created the whole show entirely, from the visuals to the animatronics to the staging of it. You know, that was his vision more than Roger Waters's.
Massive puppets, things that were sort of, 30 foot high, and string puppets that would walk across the stage. The school teacher for Another Brick in the Wall was this giant puppet with car headlights for eyes.
It's a big show and the musicians are just one, a few small cogs in a big machine. There's a lot more going on, and you just make sure you get your part right.
Any note that Pink Floyd could have played live was played live. I mean, that was the bottom line, basically. Musically, the orchestral pieces and things like the children's voices in Another Brick, we don't need no education, that stuff was pre-recorded, that was on tape. So it all had to be basically played in time.
It was all linked into special effects and click tracks and film, and so everything had to be down to the last second most of the time.
The basic structure of the whole of the first half of the show was the building of the wall up to the point where the final brick goes in, and suddenly the house lights come up and the audience realises that this vast structure, it suddenly hits them. By God, look at that, this is 150 foot across, 60 foot high, wherever it was, this vast structure has just been built in 45 minutes. But in order to get to that point, there was a piece of music built in just before the Goodbye Cruel World, where David and I would just trade riffs to give the wall builders time to get those last bricks in. Some nights it was slow, some nights, they really had to move fast, and we would play for 3 or 4 minutes. When we got the tear down the wall section, I was standing inside a cage on stage behind the wall as the wall came down. And inside the cage with me were roadies who were holding the cage up as these bricks were hammering down on it. And I was playing the guitar riff for the tear down the wall section. And it was unbelievable. And you would have a countdown on the monitors as to when the first bricks were going to come. Because if you didn't have that warning, you would just, you'd just stop playing. It was so frightening.
I think the legend of that show has built up because there's such a tremendous cachet to having been there and to having experienced it, because it wasn't this vast touring circus that went around the world for 3 years. It's 29 shows, 4 locations, that's it, see you later.
And I knew that there were tensions in the band. Very interestingly, backstage at Earl's Court, there were 4 caravans in a sort of square, and 3 of them faced into the middle of the square. Rogers faced the other way. So he didn't socialise with us. He never came to the bar in Dusseldorf. The other 3 were always there after the gig, a few scoops, chats, and whether it was going well and what could be better, and those things that anybody would talk about after a gig, but you never saw Roger. It was very much its swan song. I mean, the thing was sort of corroding, really. Alan Parker was going to shoot a concert movie, and there were going to be dramatic highlights cut in with the story that became ultimately the story of the entire movie, the thing with Geldof and the no eyebrows character, and Pink, who was just a big rag doll in our show. And then they just jettisoned the notion of the concert at all. But they filmed every night at Earl's Court for 5 nights, multi-camera shoot. I mean, people everywhere.
Well, some people have called The Wall, the movie, which came out in 1982, directed by Alan Parker, one huge clip. In other words, lots of repetition and not really focused as a movie.
My overwhelming feeling really was of disappointment. I hoped it was going to be a concert movie, and I didn't really know that it wasn't until I went to see the film. And the other thing was that I thought it was a shame that they didn't make more of the music. They used the album, just remixed bits of the album, rather than actually approach it again from scratch.
The score of The Wall suffers because of its strong song structure, and it appears to be multi-layering on the top of already strong concept and narrative, together with the visuals and animation, and oversaturating the space, which makes it much more difficult for a viewer and listener to identify with the piece.
The trial, I don't think, would have worked without Gerald Scarfe's manic visions. I mean, that is really just the culmination of all his craziness in one bonkers melting pot.
This is a really interesting song. Musically, it's immensely complex, and it's played by an orchestra. It's essentially in 2/4, so that means 2 crotchets to the bar. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And that style, 1, 2, 2 crotchets, 2/4, can sometimes be quite menacing. So that's the first thing. And what's going on top, musically, is deliberately discordant in places to create angst, to create tension. So for instance, while this is going on, you've also got an F chord against it. You've got an F sharp chord against it. There's huge tension there. You've got a G against it, even more tension. But it's not necessarily played in the order I've just played it as well. So you'll get and consequently creating even more tension.
The Scarfe's animation for The Wall could exist on its own. It succeeds on its own right. Whether it sits well with the rest of a narrative and a film imagery, that's a different question. And it often appears, if you ask audiences what do they remember from The Wall, then Scarfe's animation and music are first 2 answers that you will get.
What Scarfe did was interpret the images so well with the music that one without the other is much, much weaker. The bigger criticism I would make is that the movie itself, if you compare it with another album that made it onto the big screen, like The Who's Tommy, there's there's a lack of humour really and self-parody. It's all very, very intense. I mean, it is all on one level, and it is very extreme. But I guess it had to be. You know, that was the Wall. You know, that was the concept.
The Wall always repays the listener with new insights into an amazing creation. A magnificent achievement which stretches the horizons of Pink Floyd's musical scope to include a worldwide hit single, an ingenious Gilbert and Sullivan pastiche, and two genuine highlights from the Floyd repertoire, Run Like Hell and Comfortably Numb.
David Gilmour came up with the song Comfortably Numb. The fact that it did sneak onto the album, if indeed that was the case, was of great credit to Dave Gilmour, really, because obviously to interrupt Roger Waters' tunnel vision about that record was an amazing thing in itself.
In a strange kind of way, it's almost like their greatest hits album, because you've got these much shorter, tighter pieces of writing, much more controlled. It's less of the very long, expansive Dark Side of the Moon sort of a continuous saga. It gave them the chance to produce hit singles, which took everybody by surprise.
As far as the strength of music is concerned with The Wall, obviously with tracks like Comfortably Numb and Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, you can't say it's anything but strong. I think the strange thing is that The Wall to me does sound a little bit like a soundtrack album. I think when you initially bought that album, you felt that it wasn't quite a whole in itself. It was an element, and you needed to bolt on the other bits and pieces to get the full Floyd experience.
With the departure of Richard Wright, Pink Floyd began the 80s as a three-piece, with Roger Waters as the real power in the band. This disproportionate split of control was evident in the next album, The Final Cut, released back in March 1983. The overriding impression from this ill-favoured outing is one of a Roger Waters solo album.
The credits tell you very categorically that this is a Roger Waters work, and the fact that he didn't really involve the others really showed his disinterest in keeping the group going.
The Final Cut dwells on the politics and social landscape of Britain in the early 1980s. The focus is incredibly narrow and could almost be lifted from an editorial meeting of The Guardian, Roger's newspaper of choice. The atmosphere of the album is relentlessly downbeat, and with no melodic or instrumental relief, the darkness and bitterness are overwhelming.
What is different is that Bob Ezrin had been dismissed from the camp because he had inadvertently told an American journalist that the finale of the Wall stage show would involve it basically being demolished. So he's replaced by Michael Kamen, who's capable, who's a great catalyst. He's one of those people who can bring everyone together. And his energy in the studio on Final Cut was very important. So you could imagine, I mean, if he's such an up figure, you could imagine it could have been a lot, even more down than it already is if he hadn't been there. Pink Floyd never toured with the Final Cut, really, because I think no one wanted to tour. Particularly Roger Waters didn't want to tour. He really seemed to want to get out of the whole thing at that point.
There is a strong feeling that we are revisiting exactly the same thematic landscape as The Wall, with its exploration of the damaging effect of the sacrifices made in war. We are very much stuck in the same territory.
Well, if you look at something, a piece of music like The Wall, you're hardly going to better that. So everything's going to be downhill from there, no matter what you try, at least for a short period of time. So when you bring something out like The Final Cut, I think you've got to look at it in that context. And I think it's on record as going down that a lot of the pieces were leftover pieces from The Wall, which is where Dave Gilmour got a little upset with things.
Even the photograph on the album sleeve with the soldier holding film cans who has been cleanly knifed in the back has been widely interpreted as a reference to Roger's frustrations over the creation of the Wall movie.
A significant aspect of the Final Cut is that Pink Floyd no longer use hypnosis to design the cover. Instead, Roger Waters decides that he will design the cover himself. thereby almost proving that it's just a Roger Waters solo album.
The final cut's certainly not a brilliant album. It's brilliantly played, brilliantly executed, but it does lack the feel of things, for instance, like Dark Side of the Moon and to a lot of people, of course, The Wall, and so on. But I think the album stood the test of time extremely well when you listen to it today. I think it's a more valid piece today because it is a historical document of the time, not just of Roger Waters, you know, creating a testimony to his father, but it's actually a sign of the times in the 80s, for which most of us we can remember quite well.
As a result of a dispute with manager Steve O'Rourke, Roger Waters wrote to the record companies informing them that he would no longer be recording with Pink Floyd. Waters clearly felt that this manoeuvre would signal the end of the group.
Rogers saw it as the final cut, you know, that's the title, it's the end of Floyd, and he probably thought that's what was going to happen, but of course it wasn't what was going to happen.
He's absolutely shocked when he learns that the other two members, as they then were, Dave Gilmour and Nick Mason, intend to carry on with the group's name. But he only learns this when he essentially issues them with legal papers saying that the group is to be disbanded and the name is to exist no more.
Despite everything Waters could throw at him, Gilmour and Mason emerged victorious. They had won the right to use the Pink Floyd name, and in a further calculated snub to Waters, they hooked up again with Richard Wright and produced a new album, backed by a huge world tour. For legal and tax reasons, Richard Wright was not officially a full member of the band again. Despite the fact that he was a founder member, legally Floyd were now a duo with a hired keyboard player on wages. The album which emerged was entitled A Momentary Lapse of Reason, and demonstrated there was still plenty of life in the band, even without Waters.
I think Momentary Lapse of Reason was a fantastic rebirth of the band.
Oh, Momentary Lapse of Reason certainly did breathe new life into the group. I mean, it got them up and running again on actually a much larger scale than previously.
There was a huge appetite for Pink Floyd's music and a colossal amount of goodwill. The fans really wanted something which sounded like the Floyd of old, and sensing the mood, David Gilmour was able to produce an album which just about passed muster, although the estranged Roger Waters notoriously dismissed the album as a facsimile of the Floyd sound.
I think it was a sort of it's obviously made very much in the Pink Floyd style, but I think really it was a sort of a transition for David, who was very much at the helm of particularly at that point. Of doing it. It was a kind of solo album. I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying so, really, in a way, but obviously including the other guys in the band. But because there'd been, I don't know, 7, 8 years, whatever, had elapsed since they'd done anything, it was kind of very much kind of a fresh take on the Floyd.
Bob Ezrin is brought back for Momentary Lapse of Reason. Obviously, Roger Waters is no longer around, so there's no problems. And he's a proven commodity. It's been proven he works.
He's almost second to none as a producer anyway. And I think the results speak for themselves.
It took about 9 months altogether, and naturally, in a sort of typical Pink Floyd manner, it's not done in a studio, but it's done on a boat on the Thames that's been converted into a studio. Momentary Lapse of Reason's album cover, which features I think it's 600 empty beds on a Devon beach, is really a very good example of the new corporate Pink Floyd that emerges with Momentary Lapse of Reason.
If you look back at Pink Floyd's catalogue, it's one of the more memorable covers. People may not remember the title of the album, but they're certainly going to look at the image and go, oh yeah, Pink Floyd.
Hypnosis and Storm Thorgerson are brought back to do that sleeve. And it looks like an archetypal Pink Floyd sleeve, but like a parody of one, really. I mean, it's so excessive. How much that sleeve must have cost, the mind boggles.
I think it's a fantastic album cover. And when you bear in mind that this was done in the days when computer graphics were in its infancy, that must have been quite a hoot to have been on the beach with all those beds. And yeah, very good.
Pink Floyd began an enormous trek around the stadiums of Europe and North America, playing to huge crowds, which easily eclipsed the thin crowds which attended Waters' solo tour.
I, by chance, got asked to do Roger Waters' first solo tour, The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking. So I'd done that, and I suppose that kind of put me in a bit of a, you know, kind of who should we get to play rhythm guitar? He seems to be all right, you know. So I eventually got a call to do that, much to my surprise. I think David rang me personally to start with. That was the very first sort of introduction to it, just to see, you know, whether I'd like to be involved. And obviously, you know, it sounds like a fantastic idea. And initially, it was, I believe, planned to just go out for a number of weeks just in America, and they weren't really quite sure how it was going to all go. But it very quickly became apparent that there was a lot of demand for it. So it changed from a kind of a few weeks in America to what ended up as 16 months all around the world twice, basically. So it was quite a huge, life-changing thing. There was great sort of camaraderie within the band. We all got on instantly very well. But it was very good, very, very friendly, balanced kind of people. At the beginning of the tour, we performed the new numbers from the Momentary Lapse of Reason, and it hadn't really been released. In fact, I think when we started, I think the album I don't know if it was actually released. I think we played the first few gigs when the album wasn't actually out. So it was playing, you know, people just didn't recognise this stuff at all. But given that, the response was fantastic, really. We basically tried to keep it to the two numbers, obviously, that David was more associated with, and that sang and contributed to the writing of. So that sort of narrowed it down a fair bit.
It's the best period for Pink Floyd live that I have ever seen.
It went down so well, I'm pretty sure, because most of the public didn't really expect to ever see Pink Floyd playing anything. So it was kind of a, you know, from out of nowhere comes, oh, this band we didn't think we'd ever see. And in the past, they'd been very, very difficult to catch live. So suddenly it became kind of available, you know, in your town, you know. And particularly in America, I mean, the response was fantastic before playing a note, you know. A great deal of excitement and anticipation and stuff going on.
The shows have developed into spectaculars. Fantastic lights. I mean, people talk about, when they go and see the Pink Floyd, about the show, you know, the light show and the screens and the use of screens. And lots of other bands have taken from that idea, and they were really the forerunners of that.
Throughout the whole Floyd career, the whole production side of things, the staging, the lights, the effects and everything, were becoming an established trademark, and they were sort of expected to top each one, I think. So, you know, everything, more and more money going into research and development all the time, and coming up with lots and lots of, in some cases, very wacky ideas, things to do. So yes, I know there was several £1 million worth of investment before the tour started, and I think they were initially a bit worried that they may not actually make their money back. But I'm sure there was an element of David being determined to show everyone that they could do it without Roger. You know, I'm sure that must have been a bit of a driving force there.
The Venice gig is surrounded by mythology. The concert is intended to raise money for the Venice Restoration Fund, because Venice, as we know, is falling into the water.
There was a lot of problems with the organisation of it, and it was dealing with the very kind of unreliable local authorities. Not to say mafia, I'm not quite sure. It's a very fine line, really.
Every move that the group makes is blighted by the mafia, who want money for everything. And for example, you know, the guys who run the gondolier taxis in Venice, they'd said that if they didn't get, you know, their big payoffs, which was like a lot, like 10,000 each, they're going to sound their horns outside the concert throughout the concert. But actually the group couldn't care less about that. They're totally unaffected, because they knew they're so enormously loud by that point that, you know, no one would be able to hear these guys.
There was all kinds of bungs and threats and promises, and then promises with being withdrawn, and, you know, all kinds of, you know, everybody that could seemingly make a buck out of it was, you know, including the gondoliers, much to my horror. And there was a tremendous, well, I don't know, it was most entertaining, this situation where there'd been this VIP sort of pontoon drawn up with all these sort of celebrities and, you know, of all sorts, which was towed into position about 50 yards in front of the stage as a prime position, which was immediately bottled and canned by all the punters that got anywhere nearby. And, you know, it was all, I mean, it was very, very, very hairy. Just before we started playing, because it was a live broadcast that went out on BBC, sort of one-off in-concert type thing, and all the lights on the waterfront went off just as we were about to start. It was like, you know, it's another attempt at, and the fact that we actually got through it, the show without the power being turned off, is quite extraordinary. I mean, we were expecting that to happen. And I think also the authorities tried to block the lagoon to stop the staging from being removed after the show, because they were demanding more money for the, you know, so it was quite extraordinary. I mean, there's all kinds of, you know, devious and goings on. It was quite extraordinary. Afterwards, they threatened to sue the band because they said certain elements of stonework were damaged on the waterfront by the high decibel volume. I mean, it's just extraordinary. It's just everyone wanted a piece of it, you know.
The amount of people that came from all over Europe to see Pink Floyd created far more havoc and destruction to Venice than anything that the money that they brought to the charity would have prevented.
One rather disturbing thing was, I remember walking around Venice the following day. There was a diamond screen was put up in St Mark's Square. For a lot of the people obviously couldn't actually get a direct view of the performance, and the idea was that they'd all sit in St Mark's Square. And apparently just before we started performing, the police, the sort of riot police, cleared the square, so baton charged St Mark's Square and just drove all these people out. And so not only did they not get to see the show, but they, you know, you could see there's piles of like rucksacks and people's clothing and stuff. Yeah, so that was a bit upsetting.
The Division Bell, released in April 1994, was an altogether superior effort. Careful, studied and mannered, the album flows together as a suite of songs. There are no dramatic dynamic peaks and troughs or extremes of tempo, but the smooth, majestic flow of the music worked its magic on audiences on both sides of the Atlantic. And for the first time in history, Pink Floyd had an album which went to #1 in both Britain and America.
I love the Division Bell. I just think it's classic Floyd, completely, you know. You don't have necessarily the angry side of earlier Floyd.
Nick Mason and Rick Wright were now fully functional and part of the team. But with Dave Gilmour not being a dab hand at writing lyrics, he enlisted the help of his wife-to-be Polly Sampson, and also Nick-led Clues of the Dream Academy, to help him. Together with other collaborators, the songwriting tended to be a little diluted compared with previous efforts, where Momentary Lapse of Reason had perhaps been a collection of songs that he'd been unable to use in the previous Pink Floyd lineup.
Cluster 1 is a great example of exactly how good this band could still be sort of 30 years after its birth.
The tour which supported the album was also something of a triumph. It featured an even better and more advanced light show than anything which had gone before. And Pulse, the live album taken from the tour, beautifully captured what was certainly a career highlight for Pink Floyd. Richard Wright was also back in the fold and as a full member of Pink Floyd. In many respects, it seemed as if the band had reached the limits of its creativity and, in fact, its commercial success. There was almost nowhere else to go. Following the death of long-term manager Steve O'Rourke, David Gilmour announced to the world that he felt disinclined to continue to carry the weight of the Floyd juggernaut upon his shoulders. If there ever was a good example of the old adage that it's best to quit at the top, then this was it. Pink Floyd bowed out of the recording studio in 1994 with a magnificent best-selling album, a gigantic, awe-inspiring live show, a wonderful musical legacy, and an unmatched reputation for excellence, all left blissfully intact with no sad decline into mediocrity to taint the brilliance.